got to tell you, like I said, I flew with a good friend of mine. We get along great, and he made it a joy to fly with. The trip was so easy. He was so easy to work with. Just like you mentioned a lot of comments. When they include you in all the decision making and everything, it's so nice to be able to just work with a crew member that's just enjoys what he does as much as you do, and you could tell everybody likes flying with him, or most people do. So I had a good time.
Yeah, talk about night and day difference. We've said it many times. Having an open kind of perspective, a good personality, being friendly, being respectful, knowing your place as well, and knowing your audience is crucial as well. It helps prevent foot-mouth disease. You know that one.
Yeah.
So we were all guilty of that. Yeah. So
sure.
It is such a pleasure sometimes when you get to fly with someone who you've flown with before, who who you can consider more than just an acquaintance at work. It really changes the entire atmosphere of work. So yeah, congratulations that you got a chance to do
Thanks.
that.
Yeah, it was awesome.
So you did that trip, and you got some adventure out of it.
I did.
You rolled right into training not a couple days after that, right?
Yeah, I had 4 days off prior to starting training, and I think I mentioned in previous podcasts, I usually start studying about a month out, just kind of reviewing some of the stuff that we need to study, and we got a whole bunch of study materials that we have access to online and in our EFB, our electronic flight bags that they give us to prepare for our training event. So I started diving into that stuff, but usually the last 4 days or the last 3 days, I really, really go knee deep into the call outs, profiles, limitations. I mean, really, really get, try to make sure I know those verbatim. And I mean, I know it anyway. It's just refresher for now.
Right.
But that way, when you go into the training event, that you're not struggling with that kind of stuff, which I don't understand. People do that. They struggle with normal basic stuff that I feel you should know, like the back of your hand, should be just second nature.
Yeah.
So studied up, showed up for training, and the first day, as it's just all classroom stuff, putting out fires with a fire bottle that's filled with water, imitating it, halon, and 3 hours of systems, which just goes by in a flash, and found out who my captain would be for the simulator event the next day. He was a 20-year right seater in the Super 80, and he just upgraded to left seat on the 737 about a year or two ago.
Okay.
So
about a year's worth of flying in the left seat experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's from the area. He's like one of those good old boys. He's deep South guy. Just has a little ranch. Very, very slow Southern drawl. And he talks really slow. Nothing comes out of his mouth very fast. So it took a little bit in me to kind of like bite my tongue and sit on my hands and kind of let him go through his motions at his speed, and so it was good because that slowed me down and made me work at a crew pace, because you want to work at his pace too. And whenever you need to pick it up, you can insert yourself and say, hey, you're ready for your flaps, you're ready for your gear, or whatever, kind of prompt them. But we had a really good training event, and the check airman on the third day was made. I mean, I'm sure you get it too, Tony, from your guys, but he was so appreciative. He's like, man, you guys came so well prepared. He's like, I have nothing for you. I mean, the stuff that I have are just little tiny nitpicking stuff. But I mean, he's like, man, you guys really, really did a great job. It's like, I don't have anything to debrief you on. I mean, we were done like more than a half hour early. I mean, we were done probably 45 minutes early.
Yeah.
It was just a great training event, and I learned a lot because they really were pushing some of the hot emphasis items on the 737 this year. Were some of them were the takeoff flap settings that we have. As you will know, we have quite a bit of flaps, so quite a bit of options for flaps that we can take off with. And a couple of different power settings that we use. So there's been an increase in improper configuration of flaps and power settings on some of our departures, which is triggering FOQA alerts and stuff like that. So
FOQA is being the flight. What is that? Flight assurance.
Flight operations quality assurance, I believe.
That's it. Yeah. So now your process on a normal operation, how do you determine what your power setting and flap setting for takeoff is going to be on a normal flight for a 7.3?
So that's a good question. So the process basically starts back at dispatch. The dispatchers, when they put the flight plan together, they collect all the information from the reservation systems and all that stuff, and they get a good idea of what the passenger and cargo weight's going to be. So from that system, they basically plug in how much weight we plan on carrying for cargo and passengers. Now, what we always need to have, obviously, as you know, we always need to have enough fuel to get from point A to point B. But that's a variable number also. So, but it only varies, a couple 100 pounds on a given day. But if you have to add alternates, depending on how far the alternate is, that can vary by thousands of pounds, depending on how many thousands of pounds of fuel you carry. So, long story short, once they compile all those numbers, which is usually about an hour before, the flight planning system kicks out a planned takeoff weight. So this is all the numbers that they have figured we would, all the weight that we are going to carry for takeoff 1 hour before departure. So with that takeoff weight, it takes in all the ambient temperature and the winds and field pressure and everything, elevation and pressure, and basically all computerized. Instead of taking out your E6B or whiz wheel, it does it all in a computer thing, and it spits out your takeoff weight and the actual performance of your airplane as relative to the runway that you're taking off from. So with that being said, it determines what the most efficient power setting is and most efficient flap setting for the weight and the runway conditions of that particular airport for that airplane. Now, normally, let's say we're taking off out of Dallas, where the runways are, 13,000 pounds. I'm sorry, not 13,000 pounds.
13,000
That'd be a pretty light runway, I guess. 13,000 foot long runway. We have plenty of runway to use, and we can use the most conservative power setting and also the most conservative flap setting. Now, with that being said, the most conservative power setting for takeoff on a 737 NG is 22,000 pounds of thrust, so it's 22K takeoff, and we even reduce that a little bit more using what we call an assumed temperature, basically tricking the motor to thinking, I guess it's higher or
as if
colder.
Each manufacturer rates their engines, so at sea level, at standard temperature, this is how much thrust they would put out at max at 100%, and then they go, okay, well, how can we reduce that thrust so that we don't overstress the engines really every takeoff, because those airplanes are up and down all day long. So they go, okay, let's assume the outside temperature is much higher,
like 39 degrees or whatever. Celsius.
So in that case, because of density altitude, in very simple
pressure altitude,
it's really not that, but because it's a higher temperature, the engine would then produce less thrust.
Yep.
So what you're doing is you're putting in to the flight management computer, hey, let's put an assumed temperature that's higher. In the Airbus, we call that a flex temperature.
Flex temperature, yep.
Right. But on the 737, you call it the assumed temperature.
Temperature.
So not only were you conservative in the fact that you used a lower power setting than 100%,
right,
to save the wear and tear on the jet engine, but you're also calculating an assumed temperature on top of that primary calculation to even further reduce the thrust output, so that your engines are theoretically, say, producing only 88% power,
exactly,
100% power,
exactly. And all the stuff in the 737 is regulated by the engines. We call it the EEC, Electronic Engine Control. So basically, your interface is using the FMC and the thrust levers. So in the FMC, you just plug in the parameters with the temperatures and all that stuff, and the thrust setting, and then the EEC will automatically calculate what your N1 target will be for that particular takeoff. So that's basically that. We have let's see, trying to think of how many different flap settings. 1, 2, 3, 4 flap settings for takeoff. Flaps 1, flaps 5, flaps 15, and flaps 25. Is that right? Yeah. So flaps 25 for takeoff. So we can really we can basically dial in the efficiency of the motor and the performance of the wing for any particular condition for takeoff. So for instance, in Santa Ana or Orange County, we're having a really short runway. That's a 5,000 foot long runway. We use 27,000 pounds of thrust, which is a maximum rated thrust on the 737 NG, and flaps 25. And if the conditions allowed, we would, or if the conditions are required, we'll actually turn off the bleeds and the packs to get the most performance out of the engine. The bleeds are basically the air source off the engine. As you knew, Tony, I'm just saying this for the listeners.
Sure.
Bleed source, which provide air conditioning and a handful of other utility things that we use air for, like pressurization and anti-ice. But at a short runway like Orange County, 5,000 feet, you want every single amount of air pressure going out the tailpipe of that motor. So we turn off the bleeds, and just shortly after takeoff, we'll reconfigure the bleeds and the packs so that we get the pressurization and air conditioning back in the airplane. But for the short period of time on takeoff, we won't have any of that. So anyway, that's what a 737 takeoff kind of setting, power and flap settings are. So we've been having a trend, go back to the beginning of what started the conversation. There's been a trend of not setting the proper flaps or power settings for our takeoffs. And we were trying to, always kind of speculate what could it be.
Right.
And they say that, a lot of it could be from, we're having a lot of new hires. We have a lot of guys who are upgrading that have never flown the airplane. So they've coming from other airplanes and coming into the 737 fleet for the very first time as a captain. And it seems like all of that stuff is happening all at the same time. And the FOQA data and all the analysis show that all these things are happening around the same time that the hiring and the upgrades are happening.
So the trend is that the occurrences are happening statistically more so with either low experienced pilots in either seat. Exactly.
So they're trying to make sure we're aware of that and make sure that we adhere to company SOPs and the TEM model, right? Make sure we go through that. And actually, during training with the Czech Airmen, it was quite interesting to go through another hot topic for us was bleeds off takeoff. for some reason, we're taking off without the bleeds on when we're not required to, or we're not supposed to via the checklist or procedure. And, I'm sitting back there, I'm like, how can that happen? But we went through the checklist, and I think we counted 11 times during the checklist we're supposed to check the bleed and the pack configuration on the airplane. And for some reason, it gets past everybody 11 times. We actually make it in the air, triggers a high cabin altitude condition where, you start getting red warnings and bells and whistles going off in the cockpit. So
you've mentioned quite a few very, very telling things, very interesting, that I appreciate. The bleed off for takeoff when it's not required. This can happen for many reasons. And like you said, for the 737, you check it like 11 times. And an Airbus driver or maybe somebody that's in GA is kind of like, oh, well, wow, that sounds like a lot. What's going on? Well, it's because it's a manual process. You have to physically do it. And not only do it, but you have to do it in the right order to not get these nuisance messages, right?
Right.
And configuration problems. So you really have to be cognizant of that. It's almost like your temperature control, right? You're always constantly going, cool the cabin down, or heat the cabin up. You're constantly changing that, right? Until you get to cruise, and then the engine power stays the same. So why do you have to adjust it? But there's also something else that through our experiences, a couple decades out here on the flight line, seeing these things happen, there are those pilots out there, usually pilots in command, that take it upon themselves to go, well, the numbers say that we can take off with the bleeds on, but I don't feel comfortable with that. Let's go with the bleeds off for more performance. Okay, Captain. And then, now they're doing their, I want to say technique, but really it's a non SOP procedure. It's their technique, which is not following the SOP procedure. And then you get you're cruising up there, and after takeoff, you get distracted for your head's in a different place, and then the captain forgets to say, all right, you can go ahead, turn the bleeds on, or the FO that doesn't normally do that might forget. And that's exactly how these things can happen. It's very explainable.
So during your last training event, did they talk about that for the Airbus fleet too? Does that happen at all for the Airbus?
No. With our we can do a flaps 1, 2, 3 takeoff. Rarely ever do we do a flaps 3. Matter of fact, I think the last time I did flaps 3 was leaving Maui, I think. High performance. It's the highest performance takeoff you're going to do. You're going to do a TO or a TO takeoff, or what do they call it? A toga takeoff. Just maximum power. Flaps 3, because what are you doing when you put flaps to 3? Or don't you have more drag? Well, yes, but you also are making the wing
more lift,
longer, bigger, more surface area, so you can be airborne at a much lower speed, so that you can make that first segment climb restriction, and you can have the performance required and all that stuff. And you could lift off before the end of the runway, or your V1 calculation for your accelerated stop distance can be all. These are all technical jargon about performance. One of the weaker things that a pilot usually has in terms of their knowledge of performance, because there's so many variables and it's very mathematical. But all these factors come into play, and we rarely do a flaps 3 takeoff on the Airbus. I think I've done it maybe a handful of times in the past couple of years. The flaps 2 takeoff, which is more common, especially I've been doing a lot of transcons, so we have a lot of fuel. And so, you're going to do a flaps 2 takeoff. Sometimes now with the automated performance that we have, and we can adjust performance calculations, we can add tailwinds, we can add anti-ice on and off. We don't have to rely on the dispatcher over at Legacy Airlines to do that for us anymore. So a lot of times, like coming out of LA the other day, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, I did an LA to Miami red eye, and it's a pretty long flight. We had a lot of fuel. And it was a flaps 2 takeoff, but it was not a maximum thrust takeoff. It was still what we call a flex takeoff, which is where we calculating what the assumed temperature is, but it was still a flaps 2 takeoff because that's what the computer generated. Winds were calm. So as we taxied out to the runway, the captain goes, well, winds are calm, but just in case we get a little 2 or 3 or 4 knot tailwind at the time of departure when they clear us to take the runway, let's just run the numbers real quick with a 5 knot tailwind. And I thought, man, that's smart, because that's worst case scenario. And then you don't have to go, well, we can't accept your takeoff clearance. We have to, calculate, get the numbers, right?
Yeah.
So before we even left the ramp, I'm already, we started the engines and I'm running the numbers for a 5 knot tailwind out of LAX, and it didn't change our numbers at all. So when we got out there, regardless of if we had up to a 5 knot tailwind or winds were calm or whatever we had, we knew we were good.
Nice.
So, I mean, these little things, these little nuances, these little techniques, thinking far ahead of the scenario, not just the aircraft, really does make a big difference.
Yeah, one of the things they're just now implementing. Did I say that right?
Implementing,
Yeah, right now they're just now starting to implement is a ACARS message to mitigate the bleeds off takeoff configuration after takeoff. So in other words, if you take off with bleeds off, there's a ACARS message that comes through our printer, and we get a message on our scratch pad that says, hey, you just took off with the bleeds off. Make sure you remember to reconfigure it.
Well, that's smart.
That's a great thing to have, right?
Yeah.
And also on the rewind the clock here a couple more minutes prior to that, if you do change a runway or a flap configuration in let me say that all over again. If you request a TPS, which is Takeoff Performance System data from the computer for a different flap or different takeoff thrust setting, the computer will automatically uplink those numbers to your FMC, and you have to either reject them or accept them.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
So like in your case where you requested the tailwind, it will automatically uplink. Not only will it come off the printer, but it'll automatically electronically uplink into the computer. And if you can accept the numbers, and it'll automatically make those your new numbers. Or you could say, well, I was just like you did. I just wanted to see what it would be for performance. So you can reject them, but you have the printout ready to go so that if you did get it, you can go ahead and just plug in the numbers without having to request the data all over again.
That's a very nice feature. Yeah, we don't have that. We have you can change the runway assignment, and then it'll say, well, hey, based on the runway change, do you want us to use the preloaded numbers? And you can do that, verify that. Right. But yeah, we don't ever do that. We always verify the printout, because sometimes you don't even have the numbers for a tailwind, or you don't have the new runway that they're gonna
use. Yeah. Yep.
So and it's great. Cool. I'm glad you had a positive training experience. It's always a wonderful thing to hear from your Czech airmen, especially after your final event, that, hey, thanks for coming prepared. I mean,